Thank you for having me. And the exciting thing for all of you is that I look after MLA's data and insights, and it's about an hour after lunch and the food's hitting the belly, and I'm going to share loads of spreadsheets with you, and I know it's just what you want to see. I won't do that to you. I'm going to take you through the Southern Asian markets strategy. I'll take you through a market overview to give you a feel for the size of this market. And why am I doing this presentation? Most of the countries in this region are what we classify as defend or maintain. So defend our current position and maintain our focus on future growth opportunities. So our really short-term focus is about understanding those future growth opportunities, and we're about to kick off a big research project to do just that. Hence you have me. And by doing all of this, we'll be getting it right to deliver long-term return. So I'll take you through a market overview. How big is this market? What does it mean for beef? Have a look at the current situation. How important is this market for Australia? And again, what does it mean for beef? And finally, I'll talk to you a little bit about the future opportunity and the market research. So starting on market overview. Firstly, I better show you where this market is, because you'll hear me switch between Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, ASEAN. To be clear, I'm talking about the same place every time if I do that. We're talking about this region here. It's a bit unique compared to some of the other markets you've seen today that are individual countries. This is like the Middle East that Nick just presented. It's a region, it's a group of countries, but I'll talk about it like a single market. So to start with, how big is this market? And I'm sure you all have an opinion on this. If we start with population, this is a big market. So compared to the countries that are up here on this slide, Southeast Asia, for example, is twice the size of the US, or if you like, it's slightly less than half the size of China. So it's big. But if we think about Australian beef, we've got a premium product. So it's not necessarily the best way to determine the size of this market. I think it was Josh, maybe this morning, that introduced another way of looking at the size of the market, and that's through understanding the number of households that could afford a product like ours. So the number of households that earn over $35,000 US per year. And if you have a look at this, you can see the Southeast Asian countries are the grey ones with the number at the top there in the mustard colour. Southeast Asia is about half the size of Australia, if you think of it in terms of household earnings or affordability, or a market like the US is 20 times the size. But if we fast forward and have a look at how that's going to change, did that change? Yes, it did. And we have a look at what's that forecast to look like in the next 4 years, then it starts to change. This is a growth market. So you can see that Southeast Asia now is almost the same size as Australia, and now the US is 11 times the size. So this is a growth market. And if we think about where those households are that can afford, it looks a bit like a mess, because there's a lot of people, right? We established that with the population. There's a lot of cities in this region, and all cities are not equal. So this is showing you the average GDP per city. And really, there's only one city that's similar to the likes of Australia or the US. What does it mean for Australian beef, or for beef? Don't try and understand this chart, but basically what this chart is telling you is that a market like Southeast Asia has a much lower consumption of beef than many other markets. If you have a look at the orange dot, and you're all familiar with Australia, we eat a lot of beef here, compared to the orange dot for Southeast Asia. People eat far less beef per person in Southeast Asia. But in absolute terms, beef consumption is set to rise in Southeast Asia and rise above the other markets. So again, sign of growth. It's not without challenges though. So I know in Michael's introduction presentation this morning, he touched on market access and the importance of market access. And anyone that was here for Josh's presentation earlier referred to market access. We've got a different set of challenges to Josh's, for example, in Southeast Asia, and it's varied across the region. So the access challenges are not the same in every country. So for example, in Thailand, we have a very low safeguard, which results in a high tariff, which is reducing out to 2020. We've got the likes of Malaysia and Brunei, where we have unique halal regulations to meet when we import. And then we've got Indonesia, which has a range of technical access issues. So in terms of this market, it is a large market. It's a diverse market with opportunity for Australian beef. If we have a look at the current situation, so how important is this market for Australia? How does beef compare to other proteins? And what are we currently exporting to this market? If we start with size now, bear with me. You know I love data, I did warn you up front. You can have 3 of these charts. There's a single point for each of these charts. How you interpret this is the size of that donut is all beef exported from Australia. The dark blue part is the amount that we send to Southeast Asia. So looking at this, you can see that Southeast Asia is our 4th largest market, representing 11% of all boxed beef that we export. But that's not all that we export to this market. We also ship a lot of offal to this market. So it still remains our 4th largest market, but represents 13% of everything we ship. But still, that's not all that we send. We also send a lot of live cattle to this market. So if we add boxed, offal, and live, in value terms, this is our 2nd largest market. Big market. And in terms of consumption, so very similar to what Michael put up about China, you can see the chart on the left, beef is green versus the other proteins. Beef consumption is much lower than the other proteins. Things like fish and poultry are much larger, or pork in the likes of Singapore and Philippines. But like we saw earlier, per capita consumption across all countries is set to grow. So again, big market, room for growth. If we start to have a look at what we export to this market, this is where you see this market's really unique compared to the others. So I'll just point out 2 numbers on here. Under the word manufacturing, you can see the number 33%. 33% of all Australian manufacturing beef that is exported goes to this market, with the bulk of it going to the Philippines. And over the other side of the chart, you can see offal. So more than 1/4 of all the offal that we export goes to Southeast Asia, and that's predominantly to Indonesia. So you can imagine that how it's consumed, how beef is consumed, is very different in Southeast Asia. Here's some examples of the types and the styles of dishes that you find across the region. So again, similar to China and Michael's presentation, unlikely to go around these countries and find loads and loads of steak. What they consume looks more like this. And you can see, based on what we export, how they're used here. So for example, the bakso balls on the top left uses a mixture of manufacturing beef and offal, for example. Or the skin curry below it, which literally uses skin as the main protein in the curry. Or the picadillo on the bottom right, which is a ground beef dish. So really, really unique, really, really diverse in terms of beef consumption. And not surprisingly, our existing in-market activities reflect that diversity. And a lot of what we do is around education. So you can see in this example up here on the left-hand side, or maybe you can't see it because I don't have great eyesight and I'm right near it and I can't read it. On the top left, it says for all cuisines. So it's got the True Aussie logo, tasty and tender for all cuisines. So literally all of our activity is about educating that Australia has a great product suitable for all of those different dishes that we just saw, and supported by social media to drive people into those stores and trial the product. And the in-market activity goes across both retail and food service, and it tends to be the medium to high end. You can see retail in-store branding on the left-hand side. On the right is food service, and specifically around education, and this one in particular, a professional chef competition. And I mentioned not seeing steak everywhere earlier. It is aspirational though. So, and Michael, I think it was Michael, mentioned steak and the people taking photos on social media. So yes, it is desirable. What comes with that though, if we want to demonstrate what you do with a steak, we actually have to educate even the in-store promoters on how they handle the steak so that we get a good outcome. So basically, in terms of current situation, again, large diverse market, and our investment to date has been very, very targeted around specific opportunities. And now for the fun stuff. I can cheat a little bit because if you're in the room when Nick was just presenting, he referenced a piece of research called Attractive Cities. So we have just commenced the same thing for Southeast Asia, the same research. And it's going to go across 8 countries and 29 cities, and there's going to be loads of data that comes out of it, or 70 parameters if you want to be boring. And what it's going to tell us are what are the top 5 cities in this region that are the most attractive for future growth of Australian beef. It'll give us a profile of the markets within those cities. It'll give us a profile of the consumers within those cities. And what it means is we're going to know where the best opportunities are for Australian beef. Remember, we said this is a huge population, but affordability is low. So how do we find those people that can afford? And this will give us those answers. For those of you that were in the room this morning when Jacob presented on True Aussie and talked about brands and why they're important, it's all about understanding from a consumer's point of view what's important to them, and therefore how do you establish your brand. This research will give us the foundation in this market to do that. And it's going to assist us in establishing the brand in these new areas to make sure we're differentiated and we're out of the price and consumers value our product. It's not just about the short term though. We will absolutely get areas to focus on in the next 6 to 12 months, but it will also give us ideas about what we need to be doing to set ourselves up for success in the next 3 to 5 years as well. So it'll give us the short term, the mid term, and the long term, and what to focus on. And the reason for doing it, it's all about maximising the future investment. So we saw up front that this market, it is a growth market. Beef consumption's going up, affordability's going up. How do we grow with it? So in summary, it's a large, diverse market. We target our investment for maximum opportunity, and we're really focused on our future investment and making sure we're maximising that future investment. We call it getting it right to deliver long-term return. Thank you.
Thank you.